aerial spraying, and I was thinking maybe we can take it whatever order you want, but it might be easiest to just go in reverse order if that works for y'all. Send the microphone back down. And so we'd like to ask each of you to address what are the benefits, the impacts, and the alternatives to aerial spraying.
Okay, I'll start. So
we're looking for about 2 minutes each on this. Yeah.
Sure. So our FSC certification and the FSC standards do allow herbicides, but in the Northwest, at least, they do not allow aerial application of herbicides. I myself, try to minimize the amount of herbicide and certainly the toxicity that we use, but I consider it an important tool in our toolbox. And if you practice forestry in Western Oregon, and especially in the Coast Range, you will likely use herbicides at some point in that cycle. And herbicides may not be needed on drier sites in other parts of the state, maybe less needed for other species than Douglas fir, but it's an important tool, not the only tool, but valuable. Benefits of aerial application, aerial herbicide, is that if you're not, well, let's look at the alternative. If you're not going to apply it aerially, it will be applied by crews with backpacks, and so you often have greater human exposure, certainly for the crews, especially on steeper ground. Often more chemical will be applied, and often less precisely. So, and it's often more expensive. There are alternatives in some cases. Hand crews, as I said, you can do mechanical work in some cases, not on steep ground. You could use burning in some cases, but that has adverse impacts as well. And there are some things you can do silviculturally to reduce the amount of herbicides by extending rotations, more thinning, more shade-tolerant species.
All right, the benefits, impacts, and alternatives to aerial spraying. Well, I'm not in the business of growing trees, so I might have a very different answer than others here. So ecologically, there are no benefits to aerial spraying. It's purely an economic way of growing trees faster and reducing competition, my understanding. The impacts, however, are pretty big from an ecological standpoint. The purpose of aerial spraying is to kill off vegetation that's competing with the planted timber-producing trees. And so that means you don't have shrubs, you don't have wildflowers, you don't have other competing tree hardwoods that all provide wildlife habitat, forage for deer and elk, flowers for pollinators, which are becoming increasingly important, and habitat for a lot of songbirds that depend on what's called early seral habitat. These openings are really, these types of natural openings that aren't sprayed are really important to a lot of species, essentially. There's the potential, of course, as I know many in the room are very concerned about, with contaminating water or having a drift of some of the chemicals over humans, pets, etc. And there are potential health impacts of that to both humans and animals. So there's a lot of evidence, science, research, and stories about the impacts on people who live surrounded by clear cuts that are being aerial sprayed. So I don't need to go into that anymore, I don't think. Alternatives, well, really, as Mark said, it really depends on your goals. If your goal is to maximize the growth of trees, if you don't see an alternative, that's economical. But if you have a more potentially holistic view of growing forests, there could be. On federal public lands, they stopped aerial spraying back in the 1980s when it was proved that it was having some major impacts. And our federal public lands are managed for a lot of different purposes, and they manage to do that, including timber production, without aerial spray. Thank you.
So the benefits and impacts and alternatives of targeted herbicide application. First, on the benefit side, for us, it's just one of many management tools that we employ to manage our tree farm. It's a prudent tool for us to control competing vegetation, specifically the first 2 years after a tree has been planted. It competes for moisture, and unwanted vegetation can compete with that same moisture. We also use it to help regulate noxious and non-native species such as Scotch broom and Himalayan blackberry. The herbicides that we use are the same herbicides that you can buy in your local hardware store, and they're used here by residents. Some of the benefits we see is it's safest and fastest and most efficient method, especially in rugged, steep terrain here in the Coast Range. Some of the impacts for our tree farm and for most tree farms here in Oregon, herbicides are used just 2 or 3 times in a 50-year cycle. Compare that to urban use. It can be 2 or 3 times every year. Forestry accounts for just 4% of herbicide use in the state of Oregon annually. And forestry herbicides are heavily regulated by both state, Oregon Department of Ag and Oregon Department of Forestry, as well as federal agencies, the Department of Environmental Quality, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency. In addition to that, we layer on our own best management practices. We require that our silviculture foresters have and maintain their own pesticide applicators license. That's typically not required because we're using independent third-party licensed professional applicators, but we want our silviculture foresters to know what those requirements are so that they can maintain those efficiencies out on the tree farm. Water quality impacts. It has been proven that the highest water quality does come from forested landscapes, both public and private, and those privates do include actively managed lands. There's literally thousands of public data points that prove that. There are 3 studies that I'll mention here shortly that back that up.
About the time.
Okay. And then lastly, just as far as the alternatives, we do utilize other methods, including hand and manual application, particularly in those sensitive areas, whether it's around water or whether it's around sensitive neighbors. So I'll turn it over.
Okay, so I think that aerial spraying is a part of integrative pest management, and so integrative pest management is when you consider all of the tools that one can use in order to get rid of an unwanted vegetation, and those things can include mechanical, manual, biological, and chemicals used to be able to work as all tools in the toolbox to be able to remove a vegetation that's unwanted. Some of the specific impacts to aerial spraying, as was mentioned already, it could be unpleasant to neighbors. There is a potential for a drift of the pesticide off-site. Potentially an impact and a benefit, depending on what your viewpoint is, would be that it is a broadcast spray, so it covers the whole area. Some of the benefits to aerial spray are that you can cover a larger area over a shorter amount of time. You can cover a difficult terrain. You can minimize the spread of potential invasives and diseases by less contact of soil to soil with people being on site. It allows you to take advantage of a weather window when you cannot drive on mud roads. And so if it's a part of it's getting into the wet season, you can, without having as much impact on the soil, so you can use aerial spray to get around creating more mud and sedimentation in the streams. And as Mark said, potentially there's less operator exposure because there's fewer people on the ground.
Thank you.